Hello, and welcome to the Labor John podcast, where we learn from the past and work for the future of the history of Philadelphia and the surrounding world. My name is Grandmaster Sam James, and there's very few people going to get that joke, but I am the co-obler of the podcast. I'm the one who makes the shoes. Right, Gabe? Right, Gabe? Right, Gabe.
Cobbler is a sweet dessert.
Of course, yes. We've done many episodes on the sweet desserts of the working class history of Philadelphia and the surrounding world, haven't we?
There you go.
And usually on this show, we not only talk about the past, but we also talk about the future of the past. And today we have a special guest for another very special interview, someone who keeps the past alive. And I turn it over to my co-host.
I'm Gabe Christie. I'm the peach crumble of the podcast. And I would also like to introduce Mr. Lucas Clawson. So if you can say hello and give a brief description of yourself, a little bit of the background of the work that you do and all the crazy things that you get up to.
Well, I am Lucas Clawson, site historian with Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, which is where the DuPont Company started in 1802. If you come and visit the site, you can see a 235-acre property which is full of everything from ruins of an explosives factory to the DuPont's ancestral home from 1802 to some worker housing to a school, even ornamental gardens, all sorts of things, in a bucolic mile and a half of the Brandywine River. So as site historian, part of what I get into is helping to get our interpretive staff up to speed on some of the history of the site itself, of the people who lived and worked there, of the company, the bigger picture to things. I started off working there in the research library as lackey intern number 7, and this became my Hotel California. I haven't managed to get out, so however many years later, I've learned so much about everything there that they have come to me for a lot of what's in the collections, larger context of history. I've also spent a lot of time researching and doing a little bit of writing about American history of labor and of industry, things that go boom, all sorts of stuff.
So on that note, can you give us a brief rundown of the DuPont Company? Obviously, that's a very big ask. But I guess the Hagley site specifically.
You have 30 seconds.
30 seconds, great. So that is where the DuPont Company started. In 1802, DuPont started as an explosives manufacturer and not the chemical giant that we've all come to know and love. So they came from France in the year 1800 and had a business plan of several things they wanted to try, the DuPont family, and everything failed but black powder, which is explosives. And the reason why that succeeded is they were able to do it better really than anybody else and organize financing better than most anybody else. So that's the thing that stuck. And because they were able to grow the business pretty well by the mid-19th century, they were the largest explosives factory in the United States and then arguably the world by the end of the century. And then from making explosives, they were able to use the chemical process from smokeless powder and cellulose chemistry to go into things like plastics and paints, varnishes, all sorts of other chemical stuff. And that's what starts after 1902, the path to the chemical giant that you all know now. So when you come to Hagley, what you learn about is the DuPont Company's origins, how they started, and how the family got to the United States and started a company like that, which is still in existence.
It hadn't occurred to me what time they had actually come to the U.S. So what side of the French Revolution were they falling on?
Well, the many passports for the head of the family signed by Louis XVI will probably give you an indication of which side they fell on. Have you ever heard of a fellow named Antoine Laurent Lavoisier?
Yes.
So most folks know him as the so-called father of modern chemistry. So the scientific method, being able to replicate an experiment, being able to document everything you do so that you can prove that you've made an experiment and people can go back and check your work. He also ran the French National Black Powder Factory at Essonne, but then also had a school for black powder and saltpeter and mines, which Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, who started the black powder factory, attended in the 1790s. So Lavoisier had a pretty close connection with the DuPont family. The father, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, was a good friend of Lavoisier, and even later had an affair with Lavoisier's wife. So they were pretty close in a lot of ways. But Lavoisier had the incredible poor fortune of being someone who collected rent on behalf of Louis XVI. So he lost his head pretty quickly.
That's fair
So
enough.
yeah, they were front and center in everything going on during the French Revolution.
Well, it takes all sorts. So, okay, so I guess for most of the 19th century, they were primarily involved in gunpowder manufacture.
That is their bread and butter throughout the 19th century, making explosives.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all that they did. That they didn't get into the chemical end of things until a lot later. It's not until after 1902.
Gotcha.
So 100 years into the business do they get involved with that.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd imagine any sort of labor dispute at a gunpowder plant would be a particular, well, one of particular federal interest and particularly dangerous. So did they ever run into anything?
So that's a pretty interesting question about DuPont and labor and then labor disputes that so back to the French Revolution, that the head of the DuPont family was a member of what's called the physiocratic movement in France. And so these cats were all about education and export economy, a certain brand of politics. And they became friends with Thomas Jefferson when Jefferson was consul to the France during the American Revolution. And part of what they envisioned was kind of like this grand utopia in some ways, not only for managers but for labor. And especially whenever you're running a business where you're asking the people to work for you to run pretty heavy risks. So the DuPont family come to the United States, bring that idea with them. And to be clear from the jump here, I'm not a shill for either the DuPont family or the DuPont company. And so I came to Delaware prepared to hate DuPont. I really did, because I did a lot of work in textile mills in North Carolina. So, you're looking at the National Guard shooting at labor during strikes, Honia Path in South Carolina, stuff like that. So I thought, I'm ready to come in here and say, damn these bastards, they're terrible. But
we're gonna have to do we're gonna have to do an "Are you a cop?" moment. Are you paid by the DuPont family right now?
Legally, you have to tell us.
You have to tell us. You know that.
I am not. I am paid by the Eleutherian Mills Hagley Foundation.
Ah, damn. We needed a sponsor for this episode, Gabe.
Damn it. We still need rope.
Yes. But they're an interesting group because they didn't go the way I thought they were going to. And that whenever they set up the factory from the very jump with Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, he wrote out a prospectus of how he wanted the factory to be put together, the physical layout of everything. In part, it's a safety issue because all the buildings are separated. Everything is spaced out in a way such that if there's an explosion in one building, it doesn't blow the whole place up. But his house is almost literally on top of the black powder factory. You can walk out the back door and you're looking straight down into the factory. And I think, well, why in the heck would you do that? And he wrote in his prospectus, first and foremost, it was so that he could personally walk out, look, and see exactly what's going on. So it's a way of labor control, right? You're able to walk out and say, something's not right. I can yell down into the powder yards and say that. But another part is symbolic, where they say up front to everyone who works for them, we are showing you that we are sharing in the dangers of this thing which can kill you. So every time there's an explosion, it blows the windows out of our house just like it blows the windows out of your house. That their family members died in explosions just like workers' family members died in explosions. And that's a thread that runs throughout the 19th century, is that people are scared to death in some cases to work in black powder, but leading by example. That's the big thing that they run into. And getting into all this, another part of it is that they made it a point to never hire people who knew anything about black powder to work for them. And the idea behind that is that they want to teach you the right way the first time, because they don't want somebody coming in and saying, well, I worked for Joe Schmo up the road, and he does it this way, and I'm going to tweak this machine and end up blowing the place all to hell.
Yeah.
That's a big concern for them. They're also definitely afraid of corporate espionage, because people would come in kind of knowing what they were looking at, take the idea and run with it. So they ended up in the 18 teens and 20s going to federal court trying to sue people over patent infringements and process duplication, all sorts of things because of that. But with the people who worked for them, they tended to, not until later in the century did you really get into any labor disputes. That earlier in the century, from 1802 really into the 1890s, it's not a situation where they're eating together at the table and taking each other's kids out for dates kind of a thing. But it's also not a sell your soul to the company store sort of situation. That they made it, the DuPont family made it in a special point to say the people who work for us, we don't want them to be indebted to us. Yeah. We want them to work for us under their own free will. So we want them to be here. So they paid them quite well. If you were someone who worked directly with the powder machinery, you were making just as much, if not more, than, say, a machinist in Wilmington, or like a steam engine operator. That they're on par with high up skilled labor. And so they would start you off as ideally as a young person, as a boy, as they called it. So you're an apprentice, giving you like a $10 a month, and then work your way up. That way you start sweeping the floor and seeing all the steps in the process, and they slowly work your way up to being a full out powder man, as they call it. If you worked in the powder or were a powder man, that meant that you were somebody pretty high up in the food chain.
It's the sort of more guild-based system coming from the feudal period that, or that kind of approach to education.
And that's exactly it, which is kind of wild in contrast with the incredibly scientific way, especially Eleuthère René Dupont went about operating the factory, because his whole education with Lavoisier is based in hardcore science. These cats are some of the big players in the early the early modern Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, coming out of the Revolution. That they're front and center and all that too. Out pushing things like in environmental, being connected with the natural world, kind of like environmental rights, that they're like, well, you shouldn't junk up a piece of property because people are going to need this later. It's wild to see this mix of the cutting edge and the old world thinking in how labor is organized and structured within the black powder factory.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm right now thinking, someone who does not really know much about the DuPont family, I'm kind of liking these guys, which is a problem on this show because we usually don't do that. That is not usually how things go. But then there's a switch. Well, I want to know if there's going to be a switch. Is it going to be a switch?
Of course, there's a switch a little later.
Change? Okay.
Well, yes and no.
That's the cliffhanger.
So one of the trains of a thought that I pull through a lot of the work I've done with the DuPont company actually comes from some labor history from a guy named Bryant Simon out of Temple. He's someone whose work I'd read quite a bit when I was in North Carolina to help understand textile mills. And one of the threads that he pulls through his writing is that whenever you've got people who start a company, there tends to not be a whole lot of labor disputes. Not always, of course. But, the people who start the company are the ones who are sharing the dangers, so to speak, sharing the risk.
Yeah.
And then the next generation of owners, they know these people. They grew up with them. They're a little closer. It's not until you get the third and fourth generations where they're living off the money and not actually in the trenches making the money and working alongside the workers where you see that split, and that's a trope that I like, because that's something that I've seen quite a bit with the textile mills, but then that's also something you see over a longer period with DuPont. But fascinatingly enough, a lot of people who talk about DuPont say that they don't notice a real change until the 1980s.
Really?
With the company, that a lot of people loved working for DuPont until the 1980s. And the reason for that is that the company went public in the 1980s. So the family relinquished all direct managerial control. Maybe. So that's a huge turning point way after the era of black powder, of course. But I think that's interesting that almost everybody to a person I talk with who worked for the DuPont company talks about that disturbance in the force, so to speak, in the 1980s, where you have a shift in management. And that's not to say that there weren't labor disputes before that point, because the DuPont family, to be fair to all sides in this, they were incredibly conservative people and hated the New Deal, that FDR was persona non grata to them, were all about anti-labor, that they were big players in the American Liberty League, big players in the anti-labor movements throughout the 20s, 30s, through the rest of the century. But a lot of people that worked for them said they compensated for that by being nice people. And that's an interesting thought for me too, to hear them talk. Hear people who work for the company talk about that experience.
That's what I'm waiting for.
Yeah, so I guess my kind of building off of that, how did because it sounds like they were kind of living that turn of the 20th century progressive capitalist ideal from the beginning, in terms of like, yes, we're going to exploit your labor and take all of that, but we'll give you a not horrible life and give you some niceties so that it's not just complete drudgery. So I guess, how did that evolve after the switch to more chemical production, and into the 20th century?
The biggest switch comes in 1902. And that's when one group of DuPont family members bought the company from another group of DuPont family members. And that's when you see, so a lot of the family members didn't want to run the company anymore. To take the wider view of this, that with the American explosives industry, the Civil War was a big turning point, because nobody in the explosives industry made a heck of a lot of money off of government work. So you come through the American Civil War, it's quite a hard time for the explosives industry after the war, the way they solved the problem to deal with things like the government dumping powder on the market and depressing prices of black powder, to crazy territorial disputes in the upper Midwest for ore extraction, that the biggest purchasers of black powder are mines.
Can I pause you for a second here?
Sure.
So you're telling me there was a moment in American history where it wasn't highly profitable to be an arms manufacturer.
So this is one of the big threads of the book that I'm currently writing about DuPont in the American Civil War. That part of the reason why they do what they do is because they're not making money off the war. That the American explosives industry runs on a pretty thin margin, in part because you've got to take a lot of things into account. That first of all, black powder is not a monolithic product; it's a whole range of products. So you've got black powder, the propellant, black powder, the explosive. The propellant is what you think of as gunpowder. So you use it in cannons and pistols, rifles, that sort of thing. The explosive is what you use in blowing up rocks, ore extraction, coal extraction, that sort of thing. So the biggest purchasers of black powder are the American mining industry and the American construction industry. That all of the industry did a self-study in 1860 to figure out who bought powder. And so 80% of entire American industry output went to the mining and construction industries. 15% of total industry output went to sporting powder, so people who were target shooters, hunters, that sort of thing. And only 5% of total industry output went to the government, and that was spread across the Army, the Navy, the Revenue Cutter Service, the Indian bureaus, everybody in the government that would purchase black powder. Keep in mind that the U.S. government had committed to keep a small standing Army and Navy throughout most of the 19th century, so they would show up, order 50,000 pounds of powder, and then disappear for a couple of years. So they're not a consistent or a reliable customer. The more consistent, reliable people are industry. It's also cheaper to make explosive powders, that you don't have to run it nearly so long in the machinery. You don't have to be as exacting with how you make it. The part of the deal with the propellant powders is you want it to do exactly the same thing every time, so you have to be exacting in how you make it. That way you can replicate. You can't shoot a bullet if it doesn't do the same thing every time and expect to hit the target every time. But if you're blowing up rocks, it has to be just within a certain parameter. And 2/3 of your raw materials, another complicating factor in all this, come from somewhere else. So 75, 76% of black powder is potassium nitrate, saltpeter, and it all came out of India. So if there was any kind of problem that happened in the world, Great Britain controlled India, they can either cut off the market or raise prices at will. So anytime there's a war, anytime something crazy happens, your largest raw materials price goes through the roof. Sulfur at that point came out of Mediterranean Europe, so you're having to get this stuff from somewhere else. Shipping is incredibly expensive because nobody wants to handle something that could kill them. Also, bulk cargoes are not terribly profitable in the 19th century, so getting saltpeter is not an easy thing to do. Labor is expensive because you want to pay people well to get them to work for you, learn the job. You want to retain your labor, so you got to pay them well, treat them well, so there's high costs with that. A lot of specialized machinery goes into it. You have a lot of complicated financing that goes into it. So they're running on fairly thin margins that are susceptible to every economic downturn or war that happens in the world. And one of the ways they try to circumvent that problem is to get nitrates not from India, but from South America. So they're able to use sodium nitrate rather than potassium nitrate. The DuPont patented a process to be able to use sodium nitrate, which is way more hygroscopic. It absorbs water quicker, so it's not all that good to use for explosives until they figured out a process to be able to make it with this other material. So then they can they can bypass India altogether, get it out of South America. They cut a lot of costs down. So you get into a wartime situation, and the first thing that happens is all your materials prices go apeshit. All of your labor prices go apeshit. Everything goes crazy. You can't ship powder out because the government's restricting where you can send it. You can't get raw materials from overseas because commerce raiders are everywhere. It's not a profitable thing at all. So the black powder industry has a collective freak out over all this because the government wants to keep pushing down prices, and they have to keep advancing prices so that they're not going in the hole to make black powder. And the way they solve the problem during the war is to price fix on the government. That they all get together and say, we're not going to sell powder for anything less than this amount. And the government did its own study to figure out if nationalizing black powder would work, like they did with clothing, like with the St. Louis Arsenal for manufacturing clothing. You could close down the factory and essentially send clothing pieces to every little old lady in St. Louis and have them sew it together for you. That's cheap and easy. You can't do that with something like black powder because you can't just take that away from one group and put it in the hands of somebody else. That the government figured out they didn't have the people, they didn't have the expertise, they didn't have the capital to be able to put that together. So
you can't give little old ladies.
Surprisingly, no.
So
the Confederates tried that in Richmond, Virginia, and blew all of them up. And
that's why they lost, actually.
Yeah, I mean, when you try that, it goes badly. And ask the Confederates how that turned out for them and some of their manufacturing.
Well, you just said that the DuPont family would hire people who don't know anything about manufacturing gunpowder and all that. So, I mean, little old ladies, they don't know anything really. So maybe they would have been the prize.
You could trade people. That's the thing.
Well, you can teach the bigger picture tricks.
Well, of course you can. And one of DuPont's kind of key programs throughout the 19th century was their widow and orphan annuity program. So if a husband got killed making black powder, the widow would get $100 a year for the rest of her life, so long as she didn't remarry or move away. Okay. And the children got preferential hiring treatment, so they would go right into the powder, or they would hire widows and daughters, people like that, to put labels on black powder containers, to sew canvas covers for the Conestoga wagons, all sorts of things other than work directly with black powder manufacturing machinery.
Yeah. I think also, Gabe, we were just a young country at the time. Like, we didn't understand that we could just have a 20-year war so that Lockheed Martin could keep it in the black. You know what I mean? We weren't there yet.
Clearly.
We were still young and naive.
Yeah.
So military contracting is a very different thing. You know, that's part of what this book's going to get at is, 1863 is not 1963. It's a completely different game from World War II on. But it complicates, I think, how you think about a company like DuPont, and especially how they deal with the people who are working for them. Because this is kind of one of the threads that they pull through all this is again realizing that they need skilled people. How do you deal with the problem of needing incredibly skilled people and retaining that labor when there's so many choices?
Yeah.
Especially in a place like Wilmington, Delaware. I mean, because if you get skilled in machine work, you can go to the Pusey and Jones shipyards or Harlan and Hollingsworth and make a killing with boiler work or with machine work or something similar to what you're doing. That there was something that's kind of a portable skill set that you can easily move back and forth.
Yeah.
I mean, so you have to sweeten the pot in a certain way to keep them in the business like that.
Did they get any special dispensation for their employees to avoid the conscription during the war?
They certainly did. One of the very first things that happened was the head of the Black Powder Company got exemption from the draft for black powder workers. There was a lot of pushback against that, so the compromise was that the people who worked in the powder yards had to volunteer for militia service, so they would be armed and equipped by the federal government and would keep their day jobs, but they would drill on weekends and then guard the powder yards at night. And then if there was an emergency, they would get federalized, sent into service. So in 1863, whenever secessionist armies moved into Pennsylvania, all of the federal soldiers in the Delaware Valley got pulled out and sent toward Gettysburg to stop them. And all of the people that worked in the powder yards and around Wilmington got pulled into service. So they were guarding railroads, and a couple of them got sent to Fort Delaware to guard prisoners. So Henry DuPont, who ran the company, was pretty pissed off about this because he lost his labor force and lost his guard force in one fell swoop, and fired off a pretty strongly worded letter to the War Department and had his guys back within about 3 weeks.
Jeez.
That'll do it.
I forget where we were going before.
Hey, you're the one who said that we're just going to go off the rails and just do anything.
I mean, yeah.
So you were asking about the labor shift and then getting into the 20th century.
Yeah.
So setting the stage for that, this is where all this is going, is that the company's getting bigger, the profit margin is low, but they've got to sweeten the pot for workers. Then you get into, in 1872, the creation of a group called the Gunpowder Trade Association to figure out what to do with the aftermath of the Civil War. All that powder that got dumped on the market, all of the territories, things going crazy. So to stabilize the industry, they all get together, divide up territory, price fix, that sort of thing. It creates a relatively stable labor force because they can control who comes and who goes. But also you're able, because you're keeping your profit margin high, you're able to keep those high pay rates up there too. Where you see that start to disintegrate is after 1889. So Henry DuPont, who ran the company the longest, he ran the company from 1850 to 1889. After his death, there was a bit of a kind of a crisis as to who was going to run the company. And the people who came on afterwards, and it's a matter of trying to do cost savings, got rid of the widow and orphan annuity program. They got rid of some of the free housing. They got rid of a lot of the perks. And so that led to a little bit of labor agitation. And to the point where a couple of black powder workers burned down barns of a few DuPont family members. And the way the DuPonts solved that problem was to hire the Pinkertons to come in and squash the whole thing out.
That was farms that the DuPont family owned, not farms full of DuPont family, right?
No, farms that they own, not full of DuPont family. No.
Where do you think all these DuPonts are coming from?
Yeah, it's like a puppy mill up off the Kennett Pike.
Right.
But no, it's burning down like grain barns and stuff like that on the family farms, because there were a lot of DuPont family farms in Newcastle County, Delaware.
We always like it when the Pinkertons come into the conversation too.
Oh yeah, it's always a good time.
And they were pretty
That's
ruthless.
Switch I was talking about.
Yep, I mean they were incredibly ruthless. They came in and rooted the whole thing out, and the guys who were considered the leaders pretty much got run out of town on a rail.
Yeah,
and that more or less ended that. But that's a contentious thing too. I mean, there's still that's even in how people around here talk about that they talk about the burnings or the barn burnings here being Newcastle County, Delaware. That's something that even among some of the descendants of people who lived and worked here, that they still talk about that because of how bluntly the whole thing was put down.
Yeah.
I mean, the Pinkertons
Well,
are a pretty blunt instrument for
Yeah.
management.
Yeah. That's bringing in a sledgehammer to solve any problem. But that also tracks with even the later kind of progressive era approach to labor management, that we'll be nice to you until you slightly disagree with us. I mean, burning down a barn is slightly more than a mild disagreement, but
it could be a barn full of DuPont family members, though.
It could have been, which
kind of
is a
letting
true
them off
tragedy.
easy, tell you the truth.
Yeah.
They probably would have called in the Navy at that point.
A strongly worded letter to the leader of the Navy. Yeah.
So you get to the point of 1902 to take this out to where you first to ask about it, Gabe. That after 1902, the family members that sold it after this crisis in management, the people that owned it, the ones that owned it, didn't want it anymore. So rather than see the company sold to the next largest competitor, they a group of family members engineered a takeover. So it was a leveraged buyout. One of the big things that changed in that leveraged buyout was how they operated. So a lot of people who worked for the company realized that shift at that point, not nearly as severe as in the 1980s, but after that point, the way the books are kept, that ended completely the widow and orphan annuity program, that ended a lot of the perks, a lot of the niceties, and everybody was kind of thrown into the same pot with how you were treated as someone who worked for the company. So that's a big turning point, though, the buyout, and the people that took it over were not nearly as benevolent, I guess, as you could say, as the people who ran it before. They were looking at it more as a business. That their MO was that they were here to make money, not run a benevolent aid society. So you work for us, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's not the people who built the company who actually have more of a emotional, moral stake in it than just the business side of it.
Well, a lot of people who ran it, all of the top managers at the turn into the 20th century were people who had worked for the company. They all kind of grew up in it, and one of the main people is Alfred I. DuPont. So the big hospital, a lot of that came from Alfred I. DuPont, Nemours. That's another DuPont family estate that has the hospital attached to it. That he is someone who was deeply invested in the community and the people around him. He led the company band. He had a lot of company picnics, stuff like that. That he was known as kind of the workers' manager. But at the end of the day, they're kind of holding a lot harder of a line on labor policies than they had before, and especially how much how much you're going to get paid if there are problems. What is your pension, so to speak. If you have an arm blown off in an explosion, that's where you see some of the changes come into play.
And you were also getting to the point where you had a lot, or you started to see kind of the rise of the larger national and international conglomerates, that if there was a company who wasn't consistently in the black, there was a lot more pressure to keep everything as profitable as humanly possible, so that there wasn't a buyout. Because and that was where a lot of the trust busting of the period came in to be necessary, because you started to see that more consolidation and kind of move in towards monopolization.
Yeah, and you see that with DuPont. One of the larger byproducts of the Gunpowder Trade Association in 1872 is that DuPont either bought all of their competitors out or bought controlling interest in all of their competitors. So they came under antitrust in 1907 and got broken up in 1911 into three companies. And that is a big sea change for a lot of people at the top in the company, because that's when they take a hard turn away from the government and toward that they think that is not cool at all, that they got broken up, and especially with World War I right on its heels.
Mm-hmm.
that ended up being a big problem too. It wasn't something that showed its head until 1917 when the United States got involved. And the DuPont played hardball, incredibly hardball with the government over contracts. And one of the things they threw back in the government's face is, you're asking us to bring these other two companies under our wing and show them what to do, but you broke us up because you said we were too big. You got to make a choice here. You messed us up, so we're going to play hardball with you now. And it took them from April to December 1917 to get all of the contracts sorted for World War One.
Jeez.
I mean, it's an incredibly long negotiation process where they made the federal government front load all the contracts, where they pay for everything up front, including the building program for all the expansion. But that is a big change in their mentality in a lot of ways. That with the growth of labor in that era, you see a hard turn away from the groups like the IWW, that are on the rise. All of the labor unions that are coming into play, because there were attempts to organize and they put it down quickly. Yeah. Because they see that as part of like this rise of socialism that goes along with the government taking control of things in the run up to World War One, and they see that duplicated again during the New Deal, which is part of why Roosevelt is not a very good person to mention in front of some of the people in the 1930s in the DuPont family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of my other questions. That did the CIO ever target them?
Practically every major labor organization did. The Teamsters especially, because they had so many literally horse-drawn carriages all the way up through World War One. But then just also all the people who moved black powder. That moving it by truck and wagon was a main way to do it into the 20th century. So you still have the Teamsters that are trying to get in with them. Later the AFL-CIO, IWW, everybody you can think of, because DuPont at that point was coast to coast.
Yeah, I think how big this company is. It's like blood in the water for any union in this country.
Well, of course, and they're trying to go with both vertical and horizontal integration, having their own docks, owning a lot of their own ships, owning their own transport, every part of the factory, top to bottom, everybody who's involved with it in some way. I mean, you're right. I mean, they come under the crosshairs of every labor organization because it touches on practically every type of labor in the United States during that era.
Yeah. And I'm assuming at this point they just had the Pinkertons on retainer.
Well, they had their own police force.
Yeah. Oh, they had set up their own?
Yep, that they also had their own police force. Yep, they surely did. The DuPont Company Police. That's something that they started after 1902.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Oy.
Yeah, that they're associated with practically every factory. It's kind of wild that during World War One. Your another fun fact for the night is that during World War One, the DuPont ancestral home got taken over as a barracks for the military police force to guard the powder yards on the Brandywine.
Oh, wow.
So there's a wonderful photograph of all of them standing in uniform in front of the DuPont ancestral home.
I'm sure they were really happy about that.
Some of them were glad that they weren't having to go to France. That there's some good oral history testimony of some of the police force that worked there. And a lot of them were happy that they weren't going to France, but some of them weren't happy that every time there was an explosion, they were part of the cleanup crew.
Yeah. Well, I meant that the DuPont family was probably very happy to have a bunch of MPs taking over their family home.
Well, by that point, they had moved out. There was an explosion in 1890. 100,000 pounds of black powder went off in one of the powder yards, so that prompted the family to move out of that house. So they turned that house into a clubhouse for the workmen. So they actually reappropriated it from kind of like a pool hall shower facility to give it over to the military police.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So in the beginning, like, he stayed there to be one with the worker, and he was like, hey, if this explodes, I'm going with you. Now that it actually exploded, the family moved out and said, like, hey, workers, you can take this house. It's fine. I like that.
The couple of family members lived right next to it, but Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of that coming in that era, 1890s. One of the big shifts, especially in the era that I've been doing a lot of research and writing about with between 1840 and 1890, that when Henry DuPont, the guy who ran the company the longest, died in 1889, that was a huge sea change for the company because he had worked for the company. He grew up there with only a brief time going to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He graduated in 1833, went on a year of active service in Florida, and then ended up at resigning his commission in 1834 and coming home. So he worked for the company from 1834 until his death in 1889, and was made a company partner in 1837. But he ran the company by just sheer force of will in a lot of ways, and so one of the things that impressed me about him, he was somebody I didn't know whether I would like much until I started researching him, is that he genuinely liked the people who worked for him. And his daughters all said that, his wife said that, his son said it, that they all talked about how whenever there was an explosion, that he would sit in his office and cry because he was so upset that somebody died on his watch. And that if there was a worker who, say, was known to be a drunk, Henry DuPont would get them and say, look, you've got a family, you've got obligations to uphold. You can't work in the powder yards, but I'm going to turn you out on my farm and dry you out. I'm going to give you another chance. If you shape up after a certain amount of time, you can go back to your good powder yard job. And a lot of people did that, but a lot of people also took a hike, on account of that too. But one of the things that everybody said about him is that how much he was a hard ass on one end, because he was known as the boss, Boss Henry or General Henry, because he was a major general in the Delaware militia. But then on the other side of that, everybody talked about just what a great person he was to work for. And that shifted after his death in 1889, that nobody that came after him was looked at as fondly as he was, especially people who worked directly in the explosives factory.
So we can cut this part out since you're not done the book, but is this a reason why you're picking those years to focus on for your writings?
Where this started was actually getting to curate an exhibition on the American Civil War at Hagley. And my thought going into it was, what really can we say about the Civil War in Delaware that hasn't already been said? And come to find out quite a lot, that most everything that's been written about Delaware misses the mark.
Really?
And looking at the DuPont company, it's interesting how much of a role Henry DuPont played in keeping the state of Delaware loyal to the Union. And a lot of that comes from not only was, first and foremost, he was an absolutely adamant, staunch Unionist, end of story. He had no use for secessionists or the then Democratic Party. But secondly, he wanted to see the black powder industry stay afloat, and he saw war as a huge danger to the black powder industry. So the more I've researched this, where it spun out is to take a bigger picture of the American black powder industry and some of the forces it played, is so that what he did isn't nearly as interesting to me as why he did it.
Oh, okay.
And so the why is getting into the larger contours of the industry and the people who worked for him.
Yeah.
And that's the really interesting part.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. Well, I think unless we want to just keep going through random bits of DuPont labor history into the rest of the 20th century, I don't know how far you can take us.
Well, where I'll leave you for the moment is one of the things that I've come away with all this is that, again, I came into it fully expecting to hate DuPont and everybody who ran the company, and don't. I still don't, even throughout much of the 20th century. And that's come from spending a lot of time looking at the company's records, talking to actual DuPont family members, trying to climb into their head and what they're thinking, but then also talking with a tremendous amount of people who actually worked for the company. But then also listening to oral history testimonies. And here's a shameless plug for my own institution, that if you want a great primary resource of what labor thought, we have this great series of oral history interviews that were done in the 1950s of people who lived and worked in the powder yards earlier in the century. So the powder yards closed in 1921. So this covers people who worked for DuPont from really the turn into the 20th century, all the way up through the 1940s and 50s in some cases. And so you can get awesome, candid opinions of family members who saw the DuPont company grow, move on, talked about ancestors who worked for the company as far back as the American Civil War. So that's been just a tremendous resource to hear about the company, about the people who lived and worked there from the mouths of the people who lived and worked there. And that's at digital.hagley.org, our digital or archives. And there's an entire section where you can go and listen to these oral history interviews and see full text transcripts. And it also links you out into other primary source documents that we've scanned and put up from the DuPont family and company collections. But again, the thing that sticks with me in all this is that I don't hate them. That I come away with kind of a begrudging respect in some cases for how they handled things. And I don't agree with them 100%. But it's complicated how I think about American labor history, looking at a company as big as DuPont and how they dealt with the questions of labor, especially in the 20th century.
Well, I have certainly enjoyed this. So I just want to say thank you for coming to talk to us, Luke.